The group Judicial Watch announced Thursday the findings of its independent count of disputed ballots in Florida's presidential election. Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton talked about the findings at a news conference in Washington, D.C. It's 25 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. I have a cold, so you have to forgive me here. Okay, are we all set? Okay. My name is Tom Fitton. I'm president of Judicial Watch. My name is spelled F as in Frank, I-T-T-O-N. Judicial Watch was founded in 1994 to investigate and prosecute government corruption and abuse. In performing its mission, Judicial Watch engages in public interest litigation and education efforts. In the years since it was founded, Judicial Watch has found that neither major political party can be trusted to root out corruption within its own ranks. After last year's presidential election, Judicial Watch led the way in the investigation of the Florida election process. Just 3 days after the election on November 7th, 2000, Judicial Watch sought access under Florida's sunshine laws to the presidential ballots. Following Judicial Watch's lead, media organizations also sought access several weeks later. As the election results were being litigated by representatives of both the Democratic and Republican parties, Judicial Watch saw the need for an independent, nonpartisan analysis of the ballots at issues and the process used to count these ballots. Both political parties sought to block Judicial Watch's access to the ballots. Al Gore and the Democrats in Palm Beach County, George Bush and the Republicans in Broward County. Judicial Watch was pleased to work with media organizations also seeking ballot access to combat and defeat these vested political interests as they sought to keep these public documents away from the American people. Leading by example, Judicial Watch quickly set the parameters for how the independent recount would proceed. As others with partisan intent, such as Jesse Jackson, were talking of counting ballots and changing the election results, Judicial Watch hired an expert accounting firm to not only examine the ballots, but to conduct, as much as circumstances would allow, an independent audit of the recount process in individual counties. The media quickly followed suit, also hiring accounting and other entities to do their, quote, counting, unquote. In fact, Judicial Watch's count of the Palm Beach ballots was interrupted by the contest trial before Judge Sanders Sauls in Tallahassee. Judge Sauls had ordered that the ballots be brought to Tallahassee, so Judicial Watch followed the ballots. Judicial Watch thus was designated, after it followed the ballots to Tallahassee, in the public interest as an official observer by Judge Sauls in the historic election contest trial in Tallahassee. Judicial Watch was also authorized by Judge Sauls to monitor any recount that he might eventually authorize and oversee. Of all the parties involved in the Florida election controversy, Judicial Watch was the only entity independent of the candidates and not linked to any political party or the media. By announcing early on that it would audit the canvassing boards, Judicial Watch believes that many of the canvassing boards became even more careful in how they handled and recounted the ballots in the recount process. Over 1,000 volunteers sought to help Judicial Watch conduct its recount, and many played a helpful role, in particular in the initial review of the ballots in Palm Beach and Broward counties. Judicial Watch thought it important to conduct an independent analysis of the Florida election, analysis separate and apart from the Republican and Democratic partisans in the presidential campaign and in the canvassing boards. In addition to the inherent historical and public interest in these primary documents, the ballots, Judicial Watch wanted to provide a report to the public that could be used to enact any needed reforms in Florida and nationwide as they considered how to change their election systems. Judicial Watch hired the accounting firm of Johnson, Lambert and Company, a firm with expertise not only in the counting of ballots, but in the detection of fraud. The company has offices not only in Washington, D.C., but in Florida as well. The firm immediately found problems in some of the key counties. In Palm Beach County, for example, Johnson Lambert found discrepancies in the numbers produced by Palm Beach County officials who simply could not reconcile the results of each of their counts as they went through the recount process. This was immediately after the election. They still had no idea how many votes they had calculated by their own admission. In the Broward County, the accounting firm found that Broward County officials changed standards as they recounted ballots. They lost track of ballots and had no consistency in how they awarded votes to individual candidates. It became clear to Judicial Watch that the canvassing boards in these counties did not have the desire or expertise necessary to conduct a trustworthy recount. In fact, we had to sue in Broward and Palm Beach and in Miami-Dade to gain access to these ballots. As the citizens of the state of Florida and throughout the nation consider more modern voting systems, they should also consider how to minimize the impact of political biases of local election officials while maximizing these officials' expertise in accounting techniques to better assure accurate election results. The attached report, this is the report by the independent accounting firm Johnson Lambert, has several conclusions that will be of interest to the American people. Of primary importance is that after analyzing 42,000 of the 62,000 ballots reported as undervotes in Florida, it is the stated view of the independent accounting firm that a statewide recount of the Florida undervotes would not have changed the outcome of the presidential election. The independent accounting firm hired by Judicial Watch went beyond merely describing and counting ballots. The firm tried to critically analyze the recount procedures used by the key counties of Broward and Palm Beach. The accounting firm found that the county's procedures resulted in numbers that were unverifiable. For instance, in Palm Beach, the firm found that Palm Beach officials wrongly awarded at least 62 votes to Mr. Gore that should have gone to Mr. Bush. In Broward County, in the middle of the recount process, officials changed to a new, more liberal standard for adjudicating disputed ballots. This change in standards in the middle of the recount process may have worked to Mr. Gore's favor. Based on the attached report that we're presenting today and the independent observations of the accounting firm and Judicial Watch's representatives and volunteers, many of whom were there on the ground with the accounting firm, Judicial Watch makes the following suggestions and recommendations. Canvassing board officials should receive better training in basic accounting methods to ensure that any future recounts are performed according to generally accepted accounting principles. Canvassing board officials should consider consulting with accounting firms to help ensure that proper systems are in place to assure the public that the, quote, certified, unquote, results are accurate. Uniform standards for judging votes should be used during any recounts. These recounts should be done by an independent accountants or auditors and not by partisan officials. Judicial Watch observed that the simple act of recounting did affect the characteristics of voting cards, causing additional chads to fall off. Any new voting system should use ballots whose physical characteristics won't be changed during a recount. As for the dimple mystery, Judicial Watch used a sample voting machine and ballots from Broward County in an attempt to test how the observed dimples there were created. Judicial Watch could not recreate, using the machine, the types of dimples seen on many of the Broward County ballots. These unexplained dimples raised the specter that dimples were created by someone other than the voter. Ballot and voting security to help protect against fraud, and as important, the perception of fraud, ought to be a priority in any reform of Florida's and the nation's election system. As a public service, Judicial Watch will present this report to Governor Jeb Bush in Florida, Florida's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, and state and local officials who may have an interest, obviously, there in Florida. In addition to the appropriate committees in the U.S. Congress, Attorney General John Ashcroft, and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. We want them to use this report as they consider what to do next in reforming our electoral voting system. Most importantly, this report will be made public to the American people on the internet at www.judicialwatch.org, judicialwatch.org, Judicial Watch being one word. In this way, the American people can draw their own conclusions in the ongoing debate about the 2000 presidential election.
Tom, a couple of obvious questions. I haven't had a chance to read through this whole thing, obviously, but could we get some bottom line numbers? How many votes did Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush, respectively, gain in this or lose in this particular audit that you've done? And what is the margin by which Mr. Bush wins Florida? And secondly, 42,000 out of 62,000. What about the other 20,000?
Well, in terms of the actual numbers, I'm going to leave it, the numbers are there in the report, and I don't have them memorized, so I don't want to misstate. But based on our observations, Bush gained outside of Broward and Palm Beach, Bush gained at least 104 ballots or votes if you use the standards that were being used, counting dimples and looking at the ballots that were termed as undervotes.
So he widened his margin.
He widened his margins a little bit, and in fact, in Palm Beach, he widened it even more. The problem with Palm Beach is that Palm Beach was, it was such a mess in Palm Beach that they couldn't even get their votes in time for the state certification. So as a result, the Palm Beach results were not part of the official state certification.
Tom, can you elaborate?
What about the 20,000?
The 20,000, we're discussing whether or not to proceed to count those additional 20,000, but after looking at 42 of the 62,000 votes, it was the view of the accounting firm that the results of the election would not change, and the additional information to be gleaned would be just on repetitive in terms of what we've already found.
You said this was for not for Broward and Palm Beach County?
This does include Broward and Palm Beach.
It does include Broward and Palm Beach County.
Right. But that 116 votes includes the counties of Miami-Dade, Collier, Hillsborough, Indian River, Pinellas, and Sarasota, Florida. And depending on which standard you use, Bush gained anywhere from 104 to 116 votes. 107 to 116 votes. But the numbers are in the report.
What about the Palm Beach and Broward County votes?
Well, the Palm Beach votes using, we tried to examine the dimples, and assuming that you wanted to count dimples as votes, Gore would have lost 62 votes from the total that Palm Beach had come up with.
Tom,
which was 176 votes. So Gore's gain in Palm Beach would have been decreased by about 62 votes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on your attempts to simulate the Chads and so forth that you were unable to do? Could you elaborate on how you went about that?
Well, Broward County allowed us to borrow a ballot machine and gave us sample ballots. And we had 5 or 6 people, including members of the accounting firm, try to imitate the dimples that we saw in Palm Beach. And the unusual thing, the dimples that we saw in Broward County. The unusual thing about the dimples in Broward County that I don't think we saw in other counties was that many of the dimples had black marks on them. And it was the slightest indentation, but the thing that made it look like a dimple was the mark, and that was a telltale sign that it was a dimple. We couldn't imitate that using the ballot machines. We couldn't even imitate the dimples using the stylus in the ballot machines. Now, if you were to take the ballots out and start manipulating the ballots with your fingernail, or perhaps if you were to put them in a stack or put them on a hard surface and try to punch a ballot through, you might be able to imitate it that way. But you cannot imitate, or we could not, recreate the dimples using the ballot machine that Broward County provided to us. And we don't know how they got there otherwise. I mean, it was all the observers, including the media observers, commented that it was very unusual, these black marks.
How do you square your count with the recent count by the Palm Beach Post, which found that that Gore would have won if it hadn't been for the butterfly ballot?
Well, the Palm Beach count, the Palm Beach Post looked at the overvotes. We did not look at the overvotes. The issue at hand is the undervotes, and that's what we examined.
Why didn't you look at the overvotes?
The undervotes are what the public were interested in, and we're considering whether to look at the overvotes. But once you start assigning votes based on overvotes, you're into an area where how do you decide when you award a dimple in an undervote to Gore that a dimple and a punched clear ballot for Gore and Bush does not indicate a vote for Gore or a vote for Bush, depending on where it is. I don't know if that point is clear.
Say that again.
If a dimple indicates a vote in one circumstance, how is it in an overvote that a dimple would not represent a vote or an intent to vote for that person? So that is the problem you have with the overvotes and trying to glean what voters wanted to do from the overvotes.
Based on some of the other counts that were done, the hand recounts, can you estimate a percentage of the dimples that were that came out differently from all the handling of the vote?
It's hard to tell, but you see, they bring out a box they bring out a box of ballots, for instance, in Hillsborough County. They'd open up the box, and chads would fall out. Now, that obviously comes from handling, and it's not to say that the balloting officials were doing anything wrong, but you handle these ballots, and it should be made clear that Judicial Watch or its accounting firm were not able to touch these ballots. The only people who touched these ballots during this recount process are local county officials, and that includes the media recounts that were taking place concurrently. But it's hard to tell. But it's clear that the continued handling of these ballots caused any chad to fall off that may be hanging, or can cause them to fall off. I think these results are the most complete to date in terms of the analysis of the undervotes. I know others are continuing to look at the ballots, but we thought it was important to get this information out here as quickly as possible, especially as Catherine Harris, for instance, in Florida, is considering what to do next. And commissions throughout the United States, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission and Congress, are currently contemplating what to do next. When you see in Broward and Palm Beach the sorts of messes that were occurring in terms of their inability to do the recount and to do it in a way that people could trust it, we got to alert people as quickly as possible to that.
I'd just like to go back to his point about the overvotes. I just want to make sure I've got it clear. You're saying that trying to fathom what the voter's intent was if he made marks at both Bush and Gore is just something that you just can't really do.
Well, you could get the numbers out there, and people are going to interpret the numbers one way or another. I think when you're looking at undervotes, you can see that there is a dimple in one particular box for a president. And people can draw a more direct conclusion that maybe there was an intent to vote for that person, and if that had been counted, that vote could have been assigned to a particular candidate. If you had a dimple for Bush and a dimple for Gore, you're basically in a circular argument. If you're a Democrat, you're going to say that should go to Gore. If you're a Republican, you say that should go to Bush. The Broward County recount process was a disaster in my view. You're looking at ballots where there were dimples for Gore that were not awarded to Gore, and there were dimples for Gore that were awarded to Gore. Now, if you're Bush, you're going to say, now, how did Gore get all these votes improperly? And if you're Gore, you're going to say, why didn't we get all these extra votes? And that's because the standards that Broward County used were in flux. They changed at least twice during the recount process. And Broward County needs to get its act together so it's prepared to handle this a little bit better in the future if a recount is required. I don't think it's going to be an issue whether or not they'll be using the punch cards. Catherine Harris has announced that won't be happening anymore. But the standards in counting ballots and how to handle these ballots need to be laid out so you don't get the situation of canvassing board members changing their minds on how they're going to analyze votes in the context of the madhouse that we saw down in Florida.
How subjective was the visual recounts? In other words, did 2 or 3 or 4 people have to agree that this was really an intent of the voter or something?
Well, there are dimples there, and I think if you look at them closely, you'll see a dimple. I don't think there would be much dispute as to what a dimple is and whether it's there or not. I don't think there is much of a dispute. Our results differ a little bit from Miami and Miami-Dade in the sense that they saw a lot more dimples than we saw. I thought we were quite generous in terms of, if there was any doubt, it was a dimple. And they are difficult to see in the sense that you need to hold the ballot closely. You need to hold it at a certain angle. There was a reason that gentleman famously used a magnifying glass.
The 20,000 votes that you didn't count, where were they from?
Well, we looked at 8 counties. So 8 of the counties represented 42,000 of the undervotes.
Yeah, what were the 20,000 that you didn't look at?
Well, so that the 20,000 are dispersed among the 59 remaining counties, or 50? 50? 59. I mean, there's some of these counties maybe have 10.
I'm still confused about Palm Beach and Broward because you didn't list them as the ones you counted. You just counted Miami-Dade, Collier, Hillsborough, Indian River, Pinellas, and Sarasota.
And we did count Palm Beach and Broward.
And Palm Beach and Broward.
Yes. And that's 42,000, give or take a few votes. And we hope to testify before Congress and these committees and work with any interested entity that wants to reform the election system. There were real problems in Florida, and I think we uncovered them. And the way Broward and Palm Beach has behaved in this process has been disappointing, to put it mildly. We had to go into court, fight them every step of the way to get access to these ballots. When we initially got access to Palm Beach, it was pursuant to a court order, which was outrageous. When we had to go, it's outrageous that we had to go to court, given the fact the law is so clear. You got to get access to these ballots. You got to give people access to the ballots in Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, and Volusia County. We haven't counted Volusia yet. Prevented us from getting timely access to these ballots, which indicated they had something to hide, in our view.
This is which counties you think had something to hide?
Well, their legal actions indicated they had something to hide. Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and Volusia. I think these canvassing officials realized that their procedures would not withstand independent scrutiny. And I think we proved that in Broward and Palm Beach. Miami-Dade was actually a bit more professional in how they handled the ballots.
Back to the unexplained dimples. Any concern there was something criminal involved?
Well, I think it ought to be investigated. How did these dimples get there? We couldn't imitate them. I mean, when you see black marks on the back of ballot cards and indentations you don't see anywhere else in the other ballot cards you're looking at in other counties in Florida, I think it raises some real questions.
How many of those did you find?
I would say we didn't keep track of the black marks. The black marks were an indication of a dimple. So I would say 2/3. How about a large majority of them were black marks and indentations we could not reproduce. If you use the stylus to touch the ballot, even if you pull back before you punch through, it creates it creates something that's very obvious, and you can compare it to what you saw and what was created using the stylus to just touch the ballot and pull back, as you might think would happen in an undervote. What happened to the ballot, the observable effect on the ballot was quite different than what we saw in Broward County.
To whose benefit did these suspicious ballots, in Europe? Who benefited from the suspicious ballots? Do you have any breakdown of that?
I don't think we do. No. The change in standards did benefit Gore in Broward County. It looked like the Broward County officials initially announced that we're not going to examine, we're not going to count dimpled ballots as votes. So the Republican officials, as they went through the recount process, did not object to dimpled ballots that were marked for Bush. and those ballots never made it into the dispute pile. Well, the Gore people never stopped disputing dimpled ballots for Gore, and that did make it into the dispute pile. So when they came to adjudicating this dispute pile, they changed their standard and decided, well, we're going to count these dimpled ballots as votes, perhaps. Therefore, Gore had a bunch more votes in that dispute pile, a larger universe from which to work from, the canvassing board did, and Gore obviously got more votes as a result of that. I don't know if that was made, is that understandable? Anything else? Thank you. It will be available on the internet a little bit later this morning.
Does everybody have a book? Does everybody need a booklet?
Brian?